I will now be continuing with the previous live stream, the one previous to this one, where the live stream was titled "Stream Language is Set to English, United Kingdom." That live stream. Um, yeah, I really should try to think of better stream titles, but um, well, I was kind of relying on the thumbnail for that one, not the live stream. I guess it's fine. But I will be continuing with the book. Last stream I kind of had my way with the book, went through the pages, things like that, but I didn't actually get to read it in the last stream. But I will continue the reading, and I will do my best to read the book. I believe in the beginning I said that I found myself relating to Queen Victoria. And I believe I did find some things that made me think that. And those things are essentially the feeling of wanting, the feeling of, I guess, being a emotional person, or the feeling of wanting to have someone to pour your love out for. I believe that was something that's described in Victoria's section titled, this section on Victoria titled Girlhood, in lots of detail that was described. And I sort of had an understanding of that. Obviously, I'm not exactly Queen Victoria. We are different people. But I do find it understandable. Isn't that what people always say that we do as people? We empathize. Isn't that what people say that we do? So maybe it is strange for some to want to find friendship in a history book, but for me, it's a notion that makes sense. But I will continue. When I last left off in the stream previous to the last one, it was talking about Victoria's procession and her coronation, and now it's talking about Victoria as she's settling into the role of the Queen. Oh, and the thumbnail. The thumbnail for this live stream is this one, where Victoria receiving the news of her ascension. And I put the link to this in the description of this live stream. And it has a short description and things like that. I found it on Twitter, actually, of all places. Okay. Victoria was now able to take up riding again, and was enthusiastic about her new mounts. When towards the end of August, the court went to Windsor, Victoria began to ride regularly, and her pleasure was undoubtedly enhanced because Lord Melbourne was so often one of the party. When it became time to return to London, Victoria was sad to go. It had been, she said, the pleasantest summer I've ever passed in my life. London, too, had its pleasures. Victoria resumed her singing lessons with her old teacher Lablache and was able to indulge her love of dancing. In May, in the May of 1838, the Queen gave her first state ball, and doubtless no guest enjoyed it more than she did. She danced every dance except the waltz, though the waltzes had been danced for some little time. They were still looked upon slightly askance by the prudish, and I did remember looking up that word. Um, from memory, I can't say what that word is from memory. Um, but I do remember it having to do with such and such prudish sort of askance, like looked down upon because it was sort of risque, that kind of thing. But I will have to look up that word askance. I don't know it. I do have my notes. I do take notes on this book. I guess I'll put it down. And Victoria was of the opinion, endorsed by Melbourne, that to circle the floor in a young man's arm was rather over-familiar behavior for a young woman in her position. Later, to waltz with Albert was one of her pleasures. In spite of her self-denying ordinance, she declared that it was a lovely ball, and that she had felt so merry and gay. On her birthday, the Queen gave another splendid ball, which went on until dawn, so that she recorded gleefully, in bed it was in bed until it was broad daylight. All in all, it was the happiest birthday that she had spent for years. Much as Victoria enjoyed her riding and her dancing, she she also derived much simple pleasure from the evenings spent at Windsor or Buckingham Palace with her immediate household and a few chosen guests, of whom at least 3 or 4 times a week Melbourne was one. The Queen usually sat on the sofa, which she shared with a favourite companion. Lord Melbourne sat on a chair near to her while the rest of the company gathered round the table. Sometimes the whole party played merry games. Oh, let me. Where was I? I lost my place. Ah. But more often, the Queen and Lord Melbourne dominated the conversation, she asking his views on all manner of subjects, and he delivering on them on any topic from queasy stomachs in children, based on the fact that as a child he had been made to eat boiled mutton and rice pudding, to the education of the working class. Sometimes they looked at illustrated books, such as Lodge's portraits, which he enlivened by anecdotes concerning the originals. To Victoria's great delight, many were the evenings spent in this atmosphere of relaxed domesticity. Domesticity. Hmm. I'd never seen the word used like that, but I guess that is a way of speaking. It can be interesting to see words, things like that, familiar words in new contexts. That's one of the many joys of reading a book. I'm just looking over my notes. Yep. I was checking for books that I've written down, and I put down Lodge's portraits. That's when I started noting down the books, but they were also books mentioned that Victoria read in the section titled Girlhood when she was going through her education, which I will take a note of. It was not long before the Queen began to expect Lord Melbourne, as she called him in her journal, Lord M, to spend all his time with her and to grudge him to his older friends, even outside the hours that were necessarily devoted to business. Again and again, she writes of him as being fatherly and of his kindness in explaining difficult matters to her, as if she had been in fact his child. Both in her work and in her play, her prime minister had become the most important person in Victoria's life. The idealistic quality of the first years of her reign was to not was not to continue. By the end of 1838, the storm clouds that were to darken the sunshine of her first year were gathering. Much of the subsequent trouble the, the Queen brought upon herself was because she had allowed resentment against Sir John Conroy and her mother to affect her judgment. Towards Queen Adelaide, Victoria displayed a compassionate tact, continuing to address her as Queen and making her always welcome at court. But her own mother was potentially excluded from her private life. Although from although for form's sake, mother and daughter appeared together in public. In private, the Duchess was isolated in her own quarters, unable even to visit her daughter's apartments without permission. A part of the trouble, as always, was Sir John. The Duchess had been anxious that the Queen should show some mark of favor. Instead, Victoria had promptly excluded him from the royal household. She could not, however, prevent him from continuing to be her mother's comptroller, and the Duchess refused to part with the man whom she continued to regard as an old and loyal friend. It was not until the middle of the of 1839 that the Duke of Wellington finally persuaded him to leave, and by then the mischief had been done. Meanwhile, Lazen, taking her revenge for the years in which Conroy had made her life a misery because of her partisanship of Victoria, was fanning the fires of the royal resentment. So it appears there's some drama, bit of drama, a bit of drama. Um, yeah, um, things are happening. Um, Sir Conroy, obviously, was in the previous section was I believe, the person in charge of Kingston Palace, the place where Victoria was born and raised. And he sort of had his eyes out for Victoria, sort of, uh, his eyes on the throne, the regency, things like that, sort of putting pressure on her and making her life generally uncomfortable, things like that, as described to me in the book. So we can see sort of that influence not necessarily going away as she immediately becomes queen, but sort of staying with her and still having effect on her even as she's beginning to uh, reign over England. So we can sort of see that happening. The ties that had bound the Queen to the Baroness had remained as firm as ever. Indeed, so bitter were Victoria's feelings toward her real mother that perversely she began to substitute the Baroness for the Duchess, addressing her as dearest Mother Lazen, with an adoring adopted father, who saw the situation through her eyes, and a jealously possessive spinster cast to play the role of mother. It is hardly surprising that confronted with the temptation of damaging the reputation of one of the Duchess of Kent's most faithful friends, Victoria found herself the victim of her own poisoned emotions. Mm. The temptation to retaliate came at a time when Victoria was nervously exhausted and therefore particularly vulnerable. After the first heady delights of being queen, she was suffering from a very natural reaction. She was, after all, barely 20. Moreover, Lord Melbourne had become almost an obsession with her. She was jealous when he spent any time with his old friend, Lady Holland, and irritable whenever she thought she was not the center of his attention. Moreover, there was a nagging worry as to the political situation. Melbourne's ministry was weak and under increasing pressure from the Tory leader, Sir Robert Peel. And there are some vocabulary, things like that, that I'm not familiar with. Obviously, because I don't know the nature of royal politics, I guess. I'm not sure how to describe it. I don't know the nature of the royal government of England. I don't know what a Tory leader is. I think that's something I have to Google. Um, I guess I'll. And I did discover something. A regnancy is something specific when the queen is the leader of the British uh, government, I guess. When the queen is the leader, it's called a regnancy, and the person married to the queen can't is not named the king. They're named the prince. So the person who marries Victoria will be known as Prince. Uh, whoever what his name is, I think it's Albert, Prince Albert. Um, what I need to get up for a second. Well done. I'm back. Um, I I made myself tea, but the tea is sort of cooled down, and there isn't much I can do. But I have essentially what I can describe as sort of lukewarm, sugary, sugary water. Um, the um, the particular flavor I chose for this occasion, I prefer with lots of sugar. Um, so I had to add some sugar to my tea. I usually go without sugar, so no sugar at all, and that's what I usually prefer. But for this tea flavor, for this tea bag, I do like it, and I do have sugar. I'll have to figure out where I left off. Um, okay, I guess I'll sort of pick up from the previous sentence. She was jealous when he spent any time with his old friend Lady Holland, and irritable whenever she thought she was not the center of his attention. Moreover, there was a nagging worry as to the political situation. Melbourne's ministry was weak and under increasing pressure from the Tory leader, uh, Sir Robert Peel. Suddenly, activities which had seemed so exciting and so satisfying ceased to satisfy. Victoria had run into one of those phases of nervous irritability in which her emotions not only took control but also drove her into harboring suspicions for which there was little justification. The result was disastrous for the young queen's reputation. The central figure in the tragedy was Lady Flora's Hastings, who since 1832 had been a member of the Duchess of Kent's household, and thus an omnipresent figure from the resented past. Neither Victoria nor Lazen liked her because, apart from any clash of temperament, she had been a member of the Conroy clique. But after the Queen's accession, she still retained her position as lady-in-waiting to the Duchess. And that's Lady Hastings right there on the right. That's her portrait. It says Lady Hastings, the unfortunate lady in waiting to the Duchess of Kent, from engraving from Findon Blame. Blame for her hounding and subsequent death was laid by general opinion at Victoria's door, and monarch suffered considerable unpopularity as a result. Huh. Well, I guess we'll figure out the details right now. When Lady Flora returned to her duties at the palace after spending Christmas with her family in Scotland, she shared a post-chaise with Sir John on the journey back to London. On her arrival, Lady Flora, feeling unwell, consulted Sir James Clark, who since 1835 had been the Duchess's physician. He did not take her illness very seriously, merely prescribing rhubarb and ipecacuanha pills. Um, I will excuse myself from having to Google that, but I'm assuming that it's just medicine of the time. Whatever the trouble was, it did not prevent Lady Flora from dining at the palace that day. 2 days later, Victoria and Leeson thought they had detected an interesting change in Lady Flora's figure, and because nothing was too bad to attribute to either her or Sir John, they began to speculate as to whether she were pregnant. The mystery had never been completely solved of how Sir James Clark came to share their suspicions. Rumors then began to circulate among the Queen's ladies. It was said of approaching either Lady Flora herself or the Duchess of Kent, Lady Tavistock. The senior of the ladies of the bedchamber raised the matter with Melbourne. He, true to his character, advised waiting. He did not, however, dismiss the whole idea as nonsense, possibly swayed partly by the vehemence of Victoria's feelings, and partly because he was not altogether sorry to see the name of Hastings. The family were staunch Tories, smirched by scandal. I guess that's what a Tory leader, I guess that's a party, I guess. Political party. Moreover, Melbourne belonged to a generation that would not have been undully shocked or surprised if Lady Flora indeed been pregnant. Indeed, in view of Sir James' doubts, he may well have believed this to be the case. It was not until February, when Lady Portman came into waiting and decided that the matter could not be allowed to drift, that Lady Flora was confronted with the ugly rumor that the Duchess was also told. With courage and dignity, Lady Flora then agreed to be examined by Sir James and his colleague Sir George Clark. At a time when a woman's physical functions were obscured by a veil of sensibility and sentimentality, to submit to such an examination was a brave act. When it was revealed that Lady Flora was a virgin, this ought to have terminated the scandal. I would imagine. I would imagine that what the book is describing, what Dorothy Martha is saying to be the case. I would imagine that to be so. For it to be considerable, a considerably difficult thing to do. But Lady Flora did submit herself to be examined. So, continuing with the book. The Queen was personally upset by the false position in which she had placed both herself and Lady Flora, by neither scorching the rumors nor warning her mother about them, and did what she could do to undo the harm by sending expressions of regret and a request to see Lady Flora. But it was not until a week later that the maligned woman, shattered by both ill health and her ordeal, felt strong enough to see the Queen. By then, the situation was again worsening, and gossip began to leak through to the press. Also, the doctors who had made the examination seemed to have been trying to cover themselves by hinting that, even when a woman was technically a virgin, pregnancies had been known to occur. Hmm. Very, very not honorable, not an honorable thing to do, to from the doctor's position to say such things. But continuing with the story, people conscious of having wronged someone are inclined to welcome any explanation which can be forward to imply that the person so wronged was in fact substantially guilty, or at least that there was reason to believe this to be so. Certainly both the Queen and Melbourne seem to have snatched at the straws of the doctor's doubts and continued to convince themselves that Lady Flora was indeed pregnant. Meanwhile, both the Duchess and the Hastings family were asking how the rumor had arisen in the first case. And showing us. Hmm, hmm, cartoon in the bottom, political cartoon of 1838, showing that the Queen favors plainly shows her preference for the Whigs in Melbourne. Hmm. If the culprit, continuing with the book, if the culprit was Sir James Clark, who was also the Queen's physician, why had she not dismissed him from her service, as the Duchess had immediately done? Instead, with her usual loyalty to her friends, Victoria continued to support him. By doing so, she raised yet another of those fascinating questions of history, namely, if Sir James had not still been her chief medical advisor in 1861, would more effective treatment for typhoid have been applied earlier to the prince consort, and if so, would it have made any difference? Even the immediate effects of the Queen's obstinacy were calamitous. Uh, calamitous. That's the word. Calamitous. Um, that's obviously details going into things that we'll read later in the book. We haven't gotten to um, a case of typhoid for the prince consort. We haven't gotten to that yet, but giving us a peek, I suppose. Dorothy is into the story. That was a very segmented way to say that, but I did get my point across. Um, let's see. A letter which Lady Flora had written to her uncle giving him the details of the whole miserable story, was published in the Examiner. The publicity, which Melbourne had dreaded, had arrived. The Queen's popularity plummeted, and she could no longer bring herself to speak to Lady Flora. Meanwhile, political troubles were looming. In 1839, Britain, like her queen, was going through a bad phase. Trade had been depressed since 1837, bringing with it unemployment, especially in the urban areas where the attempts to introduce and enforce the new Poor Law Amendment Act of 1838 had led to rioting, led to rioting. Working class discontent gave rise to a new movement of protest known as Chartism, because demands were contained in the 6 points of the People's Charters. So that's why it's called Chartism. I don't know what the People's Charter is. I guess I'll have to take note of that. Let's see. Um, Big Six and Emeraldo are in the Discord chat. Emeraldo says, thank you too, Alan. All members of said movement have an ironclad will and a resolve of an intense conflagration which never wavers. I don't know if he's talking about hashtag bring back Fred. I don't know if you'd call that a conflagration. I think the word conflagration is. I don't know if it sparks the imagination. To be honest, um, but I guess you could use it. Conflagration, obviously meaning of fire. Um, let me actually Google that. Let me Google that. Fire. Let's see how it's described. An intense fire which destroys a great deal of land or property. Yeah. I'm not necessarily sure if we want the hashtag bring back Fred movement to destroy land or property. I guess I'll send that to Emeraldo. I'll get back to the book in a moment. Maybe the word can be used in like a in a biblical sense. Maybe conflagration. Not sure. I'll send him my blushed emoji. That's true. True. You gave me a fire emoji. Okay. Getting back to the book. Um, I only have about 10 minutes left. In the in what I have borrowed of the book. So I will read the book, continuing for about 10 minutes, and then I will stop. Okay, People's Charter. Okay. These were constitutional in form, but economic in motivation. And when backed by rallies and conventions, they aroused all those latent fears of social evolution which had terrified the proper, propertied classes since the French Revolution. In addition, the middle class industrialists were organizing the powerful anti corn law league to campaign for the abolition of the corn laws, which they argued hindered the expansion of trade and industry by keeping the price of bread artificially high and discouraging foreign imports. As this program was commonly regarded as a threat to the agricultural interests so strongly represented in Parliament, this too was a symptom of new pressures on the social and economic fabric of the kingdom. Even within the ministry, the radical section, which Melbourne and therefore the Queen disliked, was pressing for further measures of reform, when Peel was waiting quietly in the wings for the ministry to fall through its own weakness. While Peel The day on which Victoria would lose her often sorely tired father figure was drawing horribly close. That dread, combined with the Lady Floria affair, must have made the Queen feel how all occasions do inform against me. Although when the ministry was actually defeated in May, the combination of obstinacy and personal feeling, which had been her undoing in the Hastings affair, enabled her for a time, unlike Canute, to back the Tory tide, to keep back the Tory tide. How all occasions do inform against me. Yeah, she felt bad. Um, I want to look at this. I like this. I like this painting. Hmm. Okay, let's let's continue. There's only about 4 minutes left, so I suppose I'll stop on page 53, which is the next following page. There is every indication that by then Victoria was feeling shaken, even desperate. The miserable business of Lady Flora was still hanging over her. Sir John remained her mother's comptroller, and the Queen was beginning to develop what might almost be described as a persecution mania against both the Duchess and Sir John. In her private conversations, which Melbourne seemed incapable of getting away from this distressing topic. Yeah. In her private conversations with Melbourne, she seemed incapable of getting away from this distressing topic. By now, her one desire was to contrive her mother's departure from the palace. Yet convention decreed that, even though she was a queen, as young as young as a young unmarried woman, she could not openly shake off her maternal protection. The only alternative was one which Victoria viewed at this time with much misgiving, namely marriage. She was clearly she was a very perplexed and unhappy young woman, and to lose the support of her excellent Melbourne was something that she could not bring herself to contemplate. Yet, because he had drilled her in her duties as a constitutional monarch, they both realized that if he were no longer her prime minister, The old routine of daily letters and talks, cozy dinner parties, enlivened by his fund of information and his funny remarks. Indeed, everything that made her life bearable at this difficult time must come to an end. After his defeat in the House, Lord Melbourne was forced to tell her that he could neither come to dinner that night nor even call afterwards, and that while negotiations for a new ministry were going on, he must not see the Queen at all. Both the elderly politician and the young woman were on the brink of tears throughout the painful conversation in which he finally told her that he must resign. Victoria recorded her dreadful state of grief, while Melbourne told her that nothing had ever given him more pain than having to tell her that he must resign. When he gave her his hand, she could hardly let it go, and this look of a mingled pity and affection made her almost choke with tears, so that she could hardly speak. What came to be known as the bedchamber question must be seen against this background of personal grief. The bedchamber question. Um, hmm? Okay. Just checking the stream. Okay. Victoria intended to do her study as a constitutional monarch, as she saw the duty to be. She was perhaps unfortunate in that the conception of her role was in a state of flux, though this also gave her more room for maneuver than would be permitted a 20th century sovereign. George III had certainly considered himself to be a constitutional king, in that he had no intention of overriding either the law or the will of Parliament legally expressed. Nevertheless, he regarded ministers as his servants and felt that he had a right to expect Parliament not to attack them for purely party political motives. Indeed, as late as his accession in 1760, it was still generally accepted that the choice of ministers rested with the king, though this choice had to be acceptable also to the majority of the Commons. Hmm. constitutional king and queen sort of, I guess this sort of talking about how uh, the royalty has to work with parliament, with the politics and such. The closing years of George III's reign had seen this convention substantially eroded. William um, um, William IV had been the last sovereign to assert his right to choose his own ministers, in the hope that Parliament would ratify his choice by giving his support to Peel and Wellington. When, in November of 1834, he had asked them to form a ministry to replace the Whigs. In the general election which followed in December, Peel failed, in spite of the support of the Crown, to gain an overall majority, and though Peel held on briefly in February of 1835, a combination of Whigs, Radicals, and Irish members forced him to resign in favor of Lord Melbourne. Henceforth, it was clear that the Crown could no longer expect the Commons to support ministers merely because they had the royal confidence. Melbourne had educated Victoria to accept this as a fact of political life, and she realized that, as queen, she must ask a set of men whom she confessed to dislike to form a ministry. So far, the constitutional position was clear, and to this extent, the Queen was prepared to do her duty, though she hoped that the Duke of Wellington, and not Sir John Peel, to, to whom she had taken a great dislike, might be her new prime minister. Okay. Um, so I guess that's what that whole section was about. I was sort of getting lost, but thankfully Dorothy was able to tie it back to what was going on in the book. What was constitutionally less clear was to what extent the change of ministry must be reflected in the changes of the royal in the changes in the royal household. Unfortunately, this had been composed solely of Whigs. Victoria herself was a passionate Whig and made no pretense of being anything else. The Whigs were her friends, and the Tories her enemies. Constitutional practice had not yet hardened to the extent that it imposed a strict neutrality on the monarch, which Sir Robert could hardly view with an equanimity, a court that was peopled exclusively by his political enemies. The composition of the household, therefore, came to seem an important political question. Melbourne was anxious to soften the blow of his having to leave her realizing that if at the same time Victoria were to be faced with the loss of the familiar persons who had surrounded her since her accession, she would be put under an additional strain when she was already finding her situation almost more than she could bear. He therefore made what proved to be a most dangerous suggestion. This was that in her negotiations with Peel, she had better express the hope that none of her household, except those members who were actively engaged in politics, would be removed. This, in effect, meant that none of her ladies, even if their husbands were known opponents of the Tories, could be replaced by Tories. To the Queen, this seemed a reasonable stipulation. She was prepared to change her ministers in accordance with the will of the Commons, and she would even replace the gentlemen of her household, who were active politicians and members of Parliament, but she was not prepared to give up her ladies, whose relationship with her, she argued, was personal, not political. Um, I will stop here. I will continue reading the book when I can. Um, but it seems like it's starting to get into the political affairs, the um, the Queen's ministry, and about how Parliament chooses the Queen's ministry. Um, sort of getting into being a constitutional king or queen, and about how that affects the regnancy. Um, obviously, this was not. I did not think about this. This was not in my imagination when I thought about what it was like to rule as Queen Victoria. Um, but she, of course, did have her political opponents, this and that, and this is something that she had to go through. This sort of political dance. Um, actually, the section ends here. I could I could read the whole section. um, you know what? Um, I think I will end it here, but I suppose the next stream will just have to be titled "Courtship and Marriage." Um, I don't know what to title next stream. Maybe the next stream could be short. Maybe maybe I could do that. Um, yeah, I could do that. Let me just figure out where I left off exactly. I left off here, page 55. Okay. Well, that's the end of the stream. Thank you for watching if you did. And um, I will stream another time. Okay. Um, farewell. Farewell.